Ever since settlers from Europe began calling America their home, the oppression and enslavement of African Americans has existed. Whites forced them to perform difficult and grueling labor in horrendous conditions while giving them very little or more likely nothing in return. Even after the North won the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery was finally granted, white supremacy still existed throughout America. African Americans were forbidden from sitting in the same train or bus and even using the same drinking fountains or bathrooms as the whites. Overall, African Americans were banned from associating with whites in all public places where signs hung that read, "Negroes and dogs not allowed." However, they certainly weren't going to let themselves be subject to this kind of treatment forever, and began fighting back. Throughout the mid 1900s, African Americans staged the most powerful civil rights movement in the history of the United States. Through both political and cultural movements, African Americans across the entire country joined together and challenged the government in an effort to gain equality and an identity that was uniquely their own. One of the first significant political movements occurred in early 1964 when civil rights activists from Mississippi formed the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. By creating the MFDP, they were able to replicate democratic procedure and hold assemblies for all races. At the Democratic National Convention, Martin Luther King spoke to support the MFDP over national television, stating that any party in the world should be proud to have a delegation such as this. The true spirit of democracy finds its most profound and abiding expression. 4 years after its creation, a group of former MFDP delegates, including their leader Aaron Henry, were finally seated as the only Mississippi delegation for the DNC. Within the same year, perhaps the greatest advancement in African American civil rights took place. When John F. Kennedy was president, he had attempted to pass a bill that would finally give African Americans the rights they deserve. However, when Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, his bill sat idle on Capitol Hill with no one to move it forward. It appeared as though that was the end of things until Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's successor, signed the bill into law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a monumental point in the civil rights movement, ending public segregation and discrimination throughout the country. Furthermore, the act ensured that African Americans could attain jobs without being discriminated against. With this achievement under their belts, civil rights activists now turned to voting rights as their next goal. During this time, the violence against civil rights activists was at an all-time high. However, in August of 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. Not only did Johnson sign and pass the bill, but he also announced that he would bring about quick and powerful enforcement of it. Johnson urged African Americans to register so they could vote, making sure to quickly implement the new and extremely significant act. Finally, African American successes were multiplying through positive legislative action. Each bill passed, further providing them with rights they deserved the entire time. However, violence in response to these advancements in civil rights continued to grow, and the Black Panther Party was created to defend African Americans and the rights that they had won. Initially, this political organization called for the protection of African American neighborhoods and safety from police brutality. The Panthers followed a 10-point program which essentially were goals that they wished to achieve. A few of these goals included segregational freedom, employment, and decent housing. This party openly exercised the right of carrying loaded weapons in public and continued the threatening behavior in numerous ways that led to many conflicts with law enforcement. These conflicts led to the party being seen as a national threat. On the outside, the Panthers were powerful and menacing, but on the inside there was disagreement, tension, and controversy that eventually led to their downfall, much to the satisfaction of the government.
African Americans have been discriminated against since the moment they arrived on American soil and have fought to end it for centuries. Although there is still discrimination present in our society, it is minimal and it wouldn't be so if it weren't for the multiple forms of protest, both nonviolent and violent, during the African American civil rights movement. The various forms of protest included marches, sit-ins, boycotts, speeches, freedom rides, and the like. One of the most important marches during this period was that of the August 28, 1963 march, most notably the day that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. The NAACP, NSCC, SCLC, and CORE organized the march, which attracted 200,000 African Americans and 50,000 whites, all of which walked from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. This march birthed a whole new emphasis on civil rights and ultimately led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Marches like these occurred all across the nation, and white Americans would often fight back with violence. The police were the most brutal of those who sought to punish the African Americans for marching for equality. They would beat them with nightsticks, let the police dogs attack them, and hose them down with a high-pressure fire hose. A prime example of the violence that erupted from a civil rights march would have to be the Selma to Montgomery marches, which were marches for voting rights. The very first march, known as Bloody Sunday, began with the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Protesters were met by a wall of state troopers who attacked the protesters with nightsticks and then fired tear gas at them. 17 of the marchers were hospitalized and one was almost tear-gassed to death. In the struggle for equality and identity, African Americans also instituted sit-ins as a way to protest the racial segregation and discrimination. Even though the African Americans exercised their opposition nonviolently during these protests, the response from whites was often violent. A sit-in was when protesters would sit down in a segregated business and refuse to leave until they were served. The protesters were often violently antagonized and dragged out by the police. One of the most successful sit-ins of the Civil Rights Movement was a series of sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee from February to May of 1960. For the majority of the sit-ins, the police were present and the protesters went unharmed, but on February 27th, none were present. Nashville student activists had gathered at various local drugstores and were heckled and attacked by white crowds. The attackers were not arrested, but the protesters who refused to leave were arrested for loitering. The following morning, their story made national headlines. Another key aspect of the struggle for equality was the freedom rides. Black and white students would board buses and travel through the Deep South to protest segregation. Although there were nonviolent campaigns, they ran into violence everywhere they went. Mobs would be at every stop waiting and would savagely attack the protesters. One bus was even firebombed in Anniston, Alabama, which forced the protesters to flee the bus right into the waiting mob's hands. Even though the freedom riders had to experience hellish conditions, they were able to provoke the ban on segregation in all interstate travel facilities. Most of these bans wouldn't have been passed, though, if it weren't for the newscasters who captured the events on television. Through the negative media coverage, the horrors of what African Americans were experiencing were shown to the world, and people could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. Two of the most famous activists of the civil rights period were Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Both fought for the equality and individual freedoms of African Americans, but they had differing views as to how they were going to achieve it.
The 1960s through early 1970s was a time of rebellion. This was called counterculture. Change in America was coming. Clothing, hairstyle, food, language, and music reflected this change in the attitude of the people.
Tell me that it's evolution, well, you know.
The term black becomes socially acceptable, replacing Negroes and colored. Black power focused on racial pride, while the phrase black is beautiful showed the world that natural features of the black race, such as skin color, facial features, and curly dark hair, were no less attractive than white features. The music of this decade reflected the struggle for equality and freedom of the civil rights movement. The activists recognized the power of the music. They used this method of cultural communication to support their fight. Their protest songs combined social activism while celebrating equality and freedom. These freedom songs went along with meetings, marches, sit-ins, and their many trips to jail in the South. These songs originally came from spirituals, gospels, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and calypso melodies. The blacks were not the only ones singing these songs. White folk artists such as Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, and Janis Ian became involved. Foreign artists became involved as well, such as Paul McCartney of the Beatles, who wrote Blackbird while reading about the race riots in the United States. Bob Dylan, Aretha Franklin, the Staple Singers, and James Brown were the most influential singers during this time period. They took a stand and influenced people of all backgrounds to join the fight for equality, especially young college students. The music unified those involved in the civil rights movement through simple lyric. Dylan's adaptation of an old slave melody became the famous song called Blowin' in the Wind. Dylan was chosen to perform in Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963. Aretha Franklin's Respect, the Staple Singers' Respect Yourself, and James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud, stressed black pride and empowerment. These songs demanded respect for black rights and their achievements.
You know I got it too. All I'm asking is for a little respect when you come home.
At every civil rights rally, the song We Shall Overcome became the unofficial anthem for the movement. President Lyndon Johnson quoted from this song after attacks on civil rights workers took place in March of 1965 in Selma, Alabama. Dr. Martin Luther King also quoted from this song in his last speech before his assassination in March of 1968.
Oh, deep in my heart.
What are you willing to die for? And once you work out, once an individual works out the right
The civil rights movement influenced the history of music with the innovative artists who dared to be different, whether it was through the peaceful songs of the civil rights movement or the more radical Black Power activists. The musicians made it their goal to assist those fighting for equality through the power of music.
It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's up there.